The afternoon sun rested gently over Maple Grove estates, casting long shadows across identical driveways and carefully trimmed hedges. From a distance, the neighborhood looked like perfection: fresh paint, polished lawns, and quiet streets that gave the illusion of harmony. But beneath that stillness, something far less peaceful was taking shape. At the edge of the cul-de-sac stood a two-story colonial home with soft grey siding and white shutters. It wasn't the biggest house on the block, nor the newest, but it carried something the others didn't: a story. That home belonged to Elena Carter, a 42-year-old widow who had spent the last 15 years rebuilding her life from the ground up. Elena hadn't grown up with comfort. She had grown up with survival. After losing her husband unexpectedly to a heart condition nearly a decade earlier, she had faced a mountain of debt and the crushing fear of raising her young son alone. She worked 2 jobs for years, accounting by day, freelance bookkeeping by night, saving every extra dollar. When she finally purchased the Maple Grove house, it wasn't just a transaction. It was victory. It was stability. It was proof that hardship hadn't defeated her. She paid her mortgage on time. She followed every neighborhood rule. She kept her lawn trimmed and her mailbox polished. No late fees, no violations, no complaints. Until the letters started coming. The first notice arrived in early spring, tucked neatly inside her mailbox in a crisp white envelope stamped with the emblem of the Maple Grove Homeowners Association. It cited a minor violation. Her front garden edging was non-compliant with approved aesthetic guidelines. The fine was small, $50, annoying but manageable. Elena assumed it was a mistake. She replaced the edging within the week using the exact specifications outlined in the HOA handbook. She submitted photos. She documented receipts. She thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 2 weeks later, another notice appeared. This time, it claimed her fence stain color was outside community standards. The accusation confused her. She had used the same approved color that was listed in the neighborhood guidelines. She double-checked. She even compared her fence to 3 neighboring properties with identical shades. Still, the fine was issued, $125. Elena paid it reluctantly, believing it must have been an oversight. She didn't want conflict. She didn't have the energy for it. She had deadlines at work, college savings to think about, and a life that required focus. But the notices kept arriving. Parking violations for a car that wasn't hers, landscaping citations for overgrown shrubs that had been professionally trimmed, even an accusation that her trash bin had been left visible on a non-collection day, despite security camera footage proving otherwise. Within 3 months, the fines had accumulated to nearly $3,000. That was when something shifted. The tone of the letters changed from corrective to threatening. Late fees were added. Administrative charges appeared. Legal review costs were appended to the total. Each envelope carried language that felt less like community guidance and more like intimidation. Elena requested documentation. She asked for proof. She requested formal hearings. Her emails went unanswered. Behind the scenes, the HOA board had recently undergone a leadership change. A new president had been elected, a man with a reputation for aggressive enforcement and property value protection. Under his direction, the board began targeting what they quietly referred to as vulnerable properties. Homes owned by single individuals, elderly residents, widows, anyone less likely to mount a legal defense. Elena's home, though beautifully maintained, sat on a corner lot that developers had quietly shown interest in months earlier. Its position made it attractive for a potential expansion project if it ever went back on the market. And the fastest way to force that? Debt. By midsummer, Elena received a certified letter stating that failure to pay the escalating fines would result in a lien placed on her property. A lien could lead to foreclosure. Her heart pounded as she read the document twice, then a third time. Foreclosure. It didn't make sense. She had no mortgage delinquencies, no unpaid taxes, only these growing HOA charges that seemed to multiply without explanation. She consulted the community bylaws, reading through every page at night after work. Buried within the clauses was a section granting the HOA authority to pursue foreclosure if fines remained unpaid beyond 90 days. 90 days. The timeline was already close. Elena attempted once more to request a formal hearing, submitting certified mail this time to ensure receipt. The response was brief and cold. Her appeal had been reviewed and denied. No reasoning provided. Neighbors began to watch. Rumors started quietly, suggestions that she had fallen behind or was having financial trouble. The HOA newsletter included a vague reminder about community compliance and accountability, printed the same week her lien notice was posted publicly in county records. The embarrassment cut deeper than the fear. Elena wasn't behind, she wasn't irresponsible, she wasn't negligent, she was being targeted. The realization crept in slowly, like a chill spreading through her spine. This wasn't random. The violations were too frequent, the enforcement too selective. Other homes had visible infractions, faded paint, cracked driveways, unauthorized decorations, yet no notices appeared in their mailboxes. Only hers. One evening, as she reviewed the mounting paperwork across her dining table, she noticed something unusual. The dates on two separate violation notices overlapped in a way that was impossible. One claimed her fence was inspected and photographed on a date when she had security footage proving no one had entered her property. The inspection log timestamp didn't match reality. That detail lingered in her mind long after midnight. If the inspections were fabricated, then the fines were fraudulent. And if the fines were fraudulent, then this wasn't enforcement, it was a scheme. Elena didn't sleep much that night. Instead, she organized every document, every receipt, every photograph. She created a timeline. She compared HOA violation dates with her home security footage. Patterns emerged. The so-called inspections occurred on days when board members were documented attending off-site meetings. Some notices referenced measurements that were inconsistent with her property layout. One even cited a second warning for a violation she had never received a first warning for. It was sloppy, but it was deliberate. By early autumn, the HOA formally recorded a lien against her property. The next step would be legal foreclosure proceedings. The weight of it pressed against her chest like a stone. Everything she had worked for, every sacrifice, every late night, every promise she had made to her son about stability was now hanging by a thread controlled by a small board of neighbors. Neighbors who smiled at community barbecues, neighbors who waved politely at the mailbox, neighbors who were quietly attempting to take her home. But what they didn't know was that Elena Carter wasn't just a single mother trying to survive. There was something in her past, something she had never felt the need to reveal in Maple Grove Estates, something that would turn this entire situation upside down. And the HOA had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The lien notice changed everything. What had once felt like a series of irritating but manageable violations now revealed itself as something far more calculated. The official county record meant the situation had crossed a line. This was no longer neighborhood tension. This was legal warfare. Elena Carter had spent years building her life carefully, brick by brick, decision by decision. She understood numbers. She understood documentation. She understood process. And the deeper she examined the HOA's actions, the more obvious it became that this wasn't administrative enforcement. It was strategic pressure. Maple Grove Estates had changed in the past year. New board leadership had ushered in stricter policies under the public justification of protecting property values. But behind the polished newsletters and cheerful community emails, a quiet pattern had emerged. Homes owned outright, especially by individuals without spouses or visible legal support, were suddenly under intense scrutiny. Elena's home fit that profile perfectly. The corner lot she owned wasn't just another property. It bordered a strip of undeveloped land that had recently drawn attention from a mid-sized real estate developer. Rumors had circulated about a possible expansion project, townhomes or retail space that would significantly increase the value of adjacent parcels. If her home ever went into foreclosure through the HOA lien process, it wouldn't take long for an investor to purchase it at auction. The more she researched, the more uncomfortable the pattern became. She requested public HOA financial disclosures, something every homeowner had the right to access under state law. The response was delayed, then partially provided, then redacted. That alone raised alarms. When she examined the documents she did receive, discrepancies stood out. Legal fees charged to her account were higher than standard rates in the area. Administrative processing costs were duplicated. There were line items referencing property inspection services that appeared repeatedly on the same dates. Inspection services that her security cameras clearly disproved. Elena didn't confront them immediately. Instead, she shifted into something she hadn't used in years: strategic patience. Before she had become a full-time accountant, before marriage and motherhood, Elena had worked in regulatory compliance. She understood how organizations protected themselves on paper. She understood how fraud often hid beneath procedural language. And she knew that if someone was manipulating records, the truth would leave fingerprints. She began compiling everything into a digital archive: every notice, every envelope, every time-stamped video clip from her security system. She compared metadata. She tracked inspection times against publicly available schedules of board meetings. She cross-referenced signatures on violation reports. One name appeared repeatedly. The HOA president had personally signed most of her citations. That level of involvement was unusual. Typically, enforcement was delegated to a third-party management company, but in her case, the president had inserted himself directly into the process. It wasn't just enforcement, it was interest. Meanwhile, the social environment around her subtly shifted. Neighbors who once waved now avoided eye contact. Casual greetings became awkward nods. Someone had clearly framed her situation as financial irresponsibility. The HOA newsletter continued printing generic reminders about accountability and maintaining community standards. It was reputational pressure layered on top of legal intimidation. But Elena remained outwardly calm. She paid what she could without acknowledging the inflated totals. She requested itemized breakdowns in writing. She documented every response delay. She maintained her property meticulously, eliminating any opportunity for further violations. And quietly, she began reaching out beyond the neighborhood. Most HOAs operated under state-level statutes. Abuse of lien authority wasn't unheard of, but proving it required evidence of bad faith or falsified documentation. Elena started with the county clerk's office. She requested certified copies of the lien filing and reviewed the submission packet. That was when she found something significant. The notarization stamp on the affidavit of debt appeared slightly misaligned, as though it had been copied and reattached digitally. The signature block date didn't match the date on the violation summary attached to it. It was subtle, but in legal filings, subtle inconsistencies mattered. She then examined the inspection affidavits. Several included identical photographic angles, despite being weeks apart. Lighting conditions were identical. Shadow placement was the same. The new violations were supported by recycled photographs. That discovery confirmed what she had suspected all along. This wasn't over-enforcement. It was fabrication. At this point, many homeowners might have panicked. Some might have tried to negotiate quietly or list the house before foreclosure proceedings escalated. But Elena did something different. She went silent publicly. She stopped sending emotional emails. She stopped requesting meetings. She paid only what was legally undisputed and placed the rest in a separate escrow account, clearly documented. That move alone would later prove critical. Behind the scenes, she contacted a former colleague, someone who had transitioned from compliance consulting into real estate litigation. She didn't reveal everything at first. She simply asked general questions about HOA lien processes, fraudulent affidavits, and board liability exposure. The answers were sobering. If board members knowingly filed false documentation to initiate foreclosure, they weren't just risking civil penalties, they could face personal liability. In some states, even criminal investigation. But proving intent required airtight evidence. That was when Elena revisited something she hadn't thought about in years. Before her husband passed away, they had installed a full exterior surveillance system, high resolution, cloud-backed, with motion tracking and audio capture near entry points. She had maintained the subscription all these years for security. Most homeowners use security footage reactively. Elena was about to use hers strategically. She began reviewing months of footage, focusing not only on her property, but on the perimeter view that captured portions of the street. Patterns emerged again. On several alleged inspection dates, no one had approached her home. On others, the HOA president's vehicle was seen driving slowly past, but never stopping, never exiting. No formal inspection occurred. Yet violation reports claimed on-site review. By winter, the HOA escalated further. A notice of intent to foreclose was mailed, citing unpaid balances exceeding $7,000. The amount included compounded late fees, legal preparation costs, and something labeled administrative acceleration penalty. The language was designed to intimidate, but Elena didn't flinch. Because what the board didn't realize, what no one in Maple Grove Estates knew, was that Elena Carter wasn't just documenting for defense. She was preparing for exposure. There was a regulatory agency that oversaw HOA governance compliance at the state level. There was also a county prosecutor's office that specialized in property fraud cases, and both required one thing before opening investigations: clear evidence of falsified filings. Elena now had that evidence. The HOA believed she was cornered. They believed financial pressure would force a sale or silent compliance. They believed she was alone. What they didn't understand was that they had just crossed into territory far beyond neighborhood politics. And soon, their carefully constructed narrative was about to unravel. Publicly, permanently, and in a way none of them saw coming. By the time winter settled over Maple Grove Estates, the illusion of neighborhood harmony had thinned to something brittle. Holiday lights decorated rooftops, wreaths hung from identical front doors, and snow dusted the sidewalks evenly. But beneath that seasonal calm, pressure was building. The HOA had filed its notice of intent to foreclose. To anyone glancing at public records, it looked straightforward. A homeowner who had failed to pay accumulated fines now facing legal consequences. The board's paperwork was structured, formatted, stamped. On the surface, it appeared legitimate. But paper legitimacy and factual truth were not the same. Elena Carter understood that timing mattered. Acting too early would alert them. Acting too late could allow the foreclosure process to advance further than she could easily reverse. She needed the right moment, when their confidence was highest and their paper trail complete. So she waited. During that waiting period, the HOA grew bolder. Another violation notice arrived, this time citing holiday decor exceeding approved duration guidelines, even though it had been posted before the permitted deadline. The fine was small compared to the lien amount, but its purpose was clear. They wanted to reinforce the narrative that she was consistently non-compliant. The psychological tactic was subtle but effective. Repetition creates perception. Perception shapes community opinion. An opinion isolates. Whispers circulated more openly now. Neighbors discussed the foreclosure situation as though it were already decided. A few residents quietly checked online listings, speculating what the corner lot might sell for once it hit auction. The board continued publishing vague reminders about maintaining neighborhood standards. What no one saw was the growing digital file on Elena's laptop. She had categorized everything: chronological violation history, inspection date inconsistencies, recycled photographic evidence, signature irregularities, notarization mismatches. She even created side-by-side comparisons of images the HOA claimed were taken weeks apart. Identical shadows, identical cloud formations, identical camera angles. The repetition wasn't coincidence. It was reuse. Elena then did something the board never anticipated. She filed a formal records request under state open record statutes, not just for her own violations, but for enforcement logs across the entire neighborhood for the past 2 years. The HOA delayed. They claimed administrative backlog. They requested extension periods. They provided partial spreadsheets with missing columns. But state law was specific, and Elena knew it. When the full logs finally arrived, they confirmed what she had suspected. Enforcement wasn't consistent. Certain properties had 0 recorded inspections for over a year. Others had single minor citations quickly dismissed, but her property showed a concentration of inspections and violations that far exceeded statistical probability. Out of 87 homes, hers accounted for nearly 28% of all recorded violations. That number alone would raise eyebrows in any regulatory review. But there was more. She cross-referenced inspection dates with publicly posted HOA board meeting minutes. On multiple occasions, the president had documented attendance at city council subcommittee meetings during the same hours he allegedly performed in-person inspections at her property. 2 places at once. Impossible. The pattern was no longer circumstantial, it was structural. That was when Elena decided to escalate. She contacted the State Office of Community Association Oversight, submitting a formal complaint accompanied by her evidence package. She included video files, metadata reports, side-by-side image analyses, notarization discrepancies, and enforcement distribution charts. She did not accuse emotionally. She presented facts. At the same time, she forwarded the lien filing inconsistencies to the County Recorder's Fraud Division. Filing a false affidavit to initiate foreclosure wasn't simply unethical, it could constitute perjury. The silence that followed was tense. Weeks passed. The HOA, unaware of the external complaints, proceeded confidently. A pre-foreclosure hearing date was scheduled, notices were mailed, legal language intensified, administrative fees continued compounding. They believed momentum was on their side. Then, in early February, something shifted. The state office acknowledged receipt of Elena's complaint and formally requested additional documentation from the HOA board. The request wasn't accusatory, it was procedural. But its existence meant the board was now under review. That same week, the County Recorder's Office flagged the lien affidavit for verification inquiry. It was a small administrative notation in the system, but internally, it triggered examination. The HOA president received official correspondence requesting clarification on notarization inconsistencies. For the first time, pressure reversed direction. Board meetings, once routine and brief, stretched longer behind closed doors. Legal counsel was consulted. Emails circulated urgently among members. The narrative of simple enforcement began to wobble, yet publicly they maintained composure. A new community newsletter emphasized transparency and integrity. The foreclosure timeline remained active. Outwardly, nothing had changed. But inside the board's internal communications, cracks formed. Because what Elena had uncovered was larger than just fabricated inspections. Financial records revealed that the HOA had recently contracted with a development advisory firm to explore property value maximization strategies. That firm had recommended consolidating corner lots adjacent to undeveloped land for potential resale leverage. Her property was specifically identified in preliminary notes. The recommendation document wasn't public, but Elena found reference to it buried within a redacted financial disclosure footnote. The motive was no longer theoretical. It was documented. As February turned to March, the State Oversight Office formally notified the HOA of an audit. Not a casual review, an audit. It required submission of enforcement procedures, inspection protocols, lien authorization records, and board voting documentation related to foreclosure actions. That was when panic truly began, because board votes had never formally approved escalation against Elena's property. The president had acted under executive enforcement authority, a clause intended for emergency safety violations, not aesthetic disputes. Authority had been stretched, documentation had been manipulated, and now external investigators were asking questions. Still, the foreclosure hearing date remained on the calendar. Elena prepared to attend, not as a defendant scrambling to save her home, but as a homeowner armed with evidence that could dismantle the entire case. She organized printed binders labeled by category. She secured certified copies of her escrow payments to prove good faith compliance. She prepared a timeline showing exactly when falsified reports had been generated. She wasn't just defending herself, she was preparing to expose them. What the HOA president didn't yet understand was that the very process he relied on to pressure her, documentation, filing, procedure, was the same process that would unravel him. And the foreclosure hearing, meant to finalize her loss, was about to become the stage where everything collapsed. The foreclosure hearing was scheduled for a cold morning in late March, held in a modest county courtroom that usually processed routine property disputes. For the HOA board, it was supposed to be procedural, a final step in a calculated strategy that had been months in the making. For Elena Carter, it was the moment everything would surface. Maple Grove Estates buzzed quietly in the days leading up to it. The rumor mill had transformed speculation into certainty. Many neighbors believed the outcome was inevitable. The narrative had been shaped carefully over time. A homeowner who refused to comply, who ignored multiple warnings, who had allowed fines to spiral out of control. Repetition had done its work, but repetition collapses quickly when confronted with proof. On the morning of the hearing, the HOA president arrived confident. The association's attorney carried a neatly organized folder containing violation summaries, payment ledgers, inspection affidavits, and the lien documentation that had been filed months earlier. On paper, it looked comprehensive, structured, official. What they didn't know was that two separate oversight agencies had already begun reviewing the same paperwork. Elena entered the courthouse quietly, carrying 3 thick binders and a small external hard drive. Her posture wasn't defensive, it wasn't angry, it was controlled. Months of preparation had led to this moment. The proceeding began routinely. The HOA's attorney outlined the association's authority to levy fines, enforce community standards, and pursue foreclosure when debts remained unpaid. The violation history was presented as evidence of chronic non-compliance. The accumulated balance was emphasized. The lien was described as lawful and properly recorded. On the surface, it sounded airtight. Then Elena's documentation entered the record. She presented proof that she had placed disputed amounts into escrow, demonstrating good faith effort rather than refusal to pay. That single fact shifted the tone immediately. Escrowed funds suggested a legal dispute, not delinquency. Then came the inspection inconsistencies. Time-stamped security footage was submitted showing no inspectors entering her property on multiple alleged inspection dates. Metadata reports demonstrated that several violation photographs had been created on the same day despite being labeled weeks apart. Side-by-side image comparisons revealed identical cloud patterns and shadow angles, evidence that photos had been reused to justify new citations. The courtroom atmosphere shifted. The judge requested clarification from the HOA's attorney regarding inspection protocols. Questions followed about how enforcement was documented and verified. The president, seated behind counsel, began to lose the composure he had maintained for months. But Elena wasn't finished. She introduced the notarization discrepancy in the lien affidavit. Certified copies from the county recorder's office showed date inconsistencies. The notarization stamp alignment irregularities were pointed out. The affidavit's supporting violation summary carried timestamps that post-dated the affidavit itself. Documents had been filed before supporting evidence officially existed. The implication was serious. The judge paused the proceeding to review the materials carefully. When court resumed, the tone had changed from routine enforcement to potential misconduct. Then Elena presented enforcement distribution data across the neighborhood. Charts demonstrated that her home accounted for an abnormal concentration of violations compared to 86 other properties. She submitted copies of open record enforcement logs confirming the disparity. Selective enforcement is not illegal by default, but when combined with fabricated documentation and procedural irregularities, it becomes evidence of bad faith. At that point, the HOA's attorney requested a brief recess. Behind closed doors, urgency replaced confidence. The board members had not anticipated this level of documentation. They had assumed intimidation would end the matter long before legal scrutiny intensified. They had assumed she lacked resources, stamina, or knowledge. They had underestimated her completely. When proceedings resumed, the judge addressed the most critical issue, whether the lien had been filed based on accurate and verified documentation. Given the evidence presented, the court ordered a temporary suspension of foreclosure proceedings pending further review. It wasn't a final victory, but it stopped the process instantly. Outside the courtroom, the ripple effect began almost immediately. News of the suspended foreclosure circulated through Maple Grove Estates faster than any newsletter ever had. Neighbors who had quietly accepted the board's narrative began questioning what had truly happened. Within days, the State Office of Community Association Oversight formally announced an audit of Maple Grove's enforcement practices. The County Recorder's Fraud Division escalated its inquiry into the lien affidavit filing. The HOA board was now under external investigation from two directions. Financial records were subpoenaed, internal emails were requested, inspection contracts were reviewed, the development advisory firm's communications were examined. That was when the deeper truth emerged. Email correspondence between the HOA president and a local development consultant referenced expedited acquisition strategy regarding corner lots, including Elena's property. The language suggested intentional pressure through aggressive enforcement to create lien leverage. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was strategy. The president had believed that by escalating fines rapidly and initiating foreclosure, the property could be acquired at auction through a third-party investor aligned with development interests. The profit margin on resale would justify the maneuver. What he hadn't calculated was documentation exposure. By early April, the audit uncovered additional irregularities, not just involving Elena's home, but two other properties that had quietly been pressured into sale the previous year under similar violation patterns. The pattern was systemic. Board meetings grew tense. Some members claimed they had trusted the president's interpretation of enforcement authority. Others admitted they had not fully reviewed lien filings before authorization. Responsibility began shifting internally. Meanwhile, Elena remained outwardly composed. She continued maintaining her home. She continued working. She avoided public confrontation. But behind the calm exterior, she monitored developments closely. She knew that exposure was only half the battle. Accountability had to follow. Then came the official announcement. The foreclosure action against her property was dismissed without prejudice pending investigation findings. But more importantly, the county prosecutor's office formally opened a review into potential fraudulent filing of legal documents. What had begun as neighborhood intimidation was now a legal crisis for the HOA leadership. Maple Grove Estates, once so certain of its orderly control, now faced scrutiny that threatened its reputation entirely. And this was only the beginning of the unraveling. By the time spring returned to Maple Grove Estates, the neighborhood no longer felt polished and predictable. The same manicured lawns stood in place, the same identical mailboxes lined the street, but the atmosphere had shifted. Certainty had been replaced with suspicion. Confidence had been replaced with quiet unease. The investigation was no longer a rumor. It was official. The State Office of Community Association Oversight had completed its preliminary audit findings, and the results were not subtle. The report identified procedural violations in enforcement practices, improper delegation of authority, and documentation irregularities related specifically to lien filings. While the language remained technical, the implications were serious. The HOA board had failed to follow its own governing documents. More damaging still, the audit found that the president had exercised foreclosure authority without full board authorization in at least 3 cases. Elena's property was listed prominently in the findings, accompanied by a footnote referencing inconsistencies between reported inspection activity and verifiable evidence. The county recorder's fraud inquiry intensified in parallel. Forensic document analysis confirmed that the lien affidavit filed against Elena's home contained metadata inconsistencies. The timestamp embedded in the digital file indicated modification after notarization. That single technical detail carried enormous weight. It suggested alteration of a sworn legal document after official certification. In legal terms, that crossed from administrative error into potential fraud. Within days of the audit summary circulating privately among board members, cracks turned into fractures. 2 HOA board members resigned abruptly, citing personal reasons. Their resignation letters were brief and non-confrontational, but the timing was unmistakable. The treasurer requested independent legal counsel. The association's insurance provider was notified of potential liability exposure. Insurance carriers do not take kindly to fraudulent filings. Meanwhile, Elena's foreclosure case remained dismissed pending further findings. The lien was flagged in county records as under investigation, preventing any further enforcement action. The financial pressure that had once loomed over her home evaporated almost overnight. But she understood something critical. Stopping the foreclosure was not the same as restoring justice. The damage to her reputation, the emotional strain, the months of calculated intimidation, those consequences did not disappear simply because proceedings were paused. So she continued forward. With guidance from her legal consultant, Elena filed a civil demand letter to the HOA requesting immediate removal of the lien, reimbursement of all improperly assessed fines, coverage of legal consultation costs, and a formal written acknowledgement of enforcement errors. The letter was precise. It cited audit findings. It referenced state statutes governing fiduciary duty and bad faith enforcement. It did not threaten loudly. It positioned consequences clearly. The HOA's attorney responded cautiously. The association proposed a mutual resolution agreement that would quietly remove the lien without admission of wrongdoing. In exchange, Elena would withdraw all complaints and agree not to pursue further action. It was an attempt to contain fallout, but Elena declined, because the truth had grown larger than her individual case. As the investigation expanded, 2 former homeowners from Maple Grove came forward. Both had sold their homes the previous year after mounting violation fines and lien threats. Both reported unusually aggressive enforcement patterns. One had been elderly and living on a fixed income. The other had been a recent divorcee navigating financial uncertainty. Their cases mirrored hers. The enforcement distribution logs confirmed it. Properties targeted had common characteristics, ownership structures that appeared less likely to mount legal defense. The pattern was unmistakable once viewed collectively. Local media began to notice. A small investigative segment aired on a regional news channel covering HOA governance concerns in suburban communities. Maple Grove Estates was not initially named, but descriptions aligned closely. Soon after, public records requests made the association's audit report accessible. The name surfaced. Reputation shifted from controlled exclusivity to controversy. Homeowners who had once trusted board leadership began requesting special meetings. Questions filled inboxes. Why had enforcement been so concentrated? Why were foreclosure powers exercised without full board votes? Why had financial disclosures been redacted? The president, once assertive and commanding, appeared increasingly isolated. Internal emails revealed he had downplayed oversight risks to other board members. He had assured them documentation was solid. He had described Elena as non-compliant and uncooperative. Now documentation contradicted him. In late April, the state office issued a formal compliance order requiring the HOA to suspend all new enforcement actions until corrective procedures were implemented. Independent oversight would monitor future lien filings. The association was mandated to revise its enforcement policy and provide transparent documentation access to all homeowners. The order was public record. Then came the turning point. The county prosecutor's office concluded its preliminary review and referred the lien affidavit matter for potential charges related to falsification of a legal document. While charges were not immediately filed, the referral alone carried devastating weight. The HOA president resigned 3 days later. His resignation letter cited health and personal matters, but no one in Maple Grove believed that explanation. The departure was abrupt. The authority he had wielded so confidently dissolved overnight. With leadership vacant and public trust fractured, the remaining board members moved quickly to contain long-term damage. They voted unanimously to remove the lien against Elena's property permanently. All fines assessed against her were voided retroactively. A formal written apology, carefully worded but unmistakable, was delivered to her home via certified mail. It acknowledged procedural failures. It acknowledged enforcement irregularities. It acknowledged that foreclosure action had been premature and unsupported by verified inspection evidence. For the first time in nearly a year, Elena exhaled fully inside her own home. But the story was no longer just about her house. It was about exposure. The investigation had forced transparency. It had revealed systemic misuse of authority. It had empowered other homeowners to question practices they had once assumed were unchallengeable. Maple Grove Estates would never operate the same way again, and the shocking truth that destroyed the HOA's plan had done more than protect one woman's property. It had dismantled an entire strategy built on intimidation and silence. Yet one final chapter remained, because while institutions can recover, trust once broken demands something deeper than policy reform. It demands accountability. By early summer, Maple Grove Estates looked the same on the surface, but beneath the uniform hedges and symmetrical driveways, the neighborhood had transformed in ways that couldn't be captured in landscaping photos or glossy HOA newsletters. The investigation had done more than halt a foreclosure. It had exposed a system that relied on silence. In the weeks following the president's resignation, the remaining board members appointed an interim leadership committee under direct supervision from the State Office of Community Association Oversight. Mandatory governance training was scheduled. Financial transparency requirements were expanded. Inspection procedures were rewritten to require third-party verification and timestamp authentication. Every lien moving forward would require a full recorded board vote. Every violation would require documented, verifiable inspection evidence. The power that once operated quietly behind closed doors was now bound by scrutiny. For Elena Carter, the changes were tangible. The lien was officially removed from county records. A formal release document was recorded publicly, clearing her property title completely. The escrow funds she had preserved were returned to her account. Legal consultation costs were reimbursed under the HOA's insurance policy. But the real shift wasn't financial. It was reputational. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact began approaching her cautiously. Some offered quiet apologies for assumptions they had made. Others admitted they had felt intimidated by the board, but never believed they could challenge it. A few shared their own minor experiences with questionable enforcement, small fines they had paid without protest, simply to avoid conflict. What Elena's case had proven was simple but powerful. Authority unchecked becomes vulnerable to misuse, and misuse collapses when exposed to light. Local media eventually covered the story directly. Maple Grove Estates was named. The report detailed selective enforcement patterns, the fraudulent lien filing under review, and the state-mandated oversight reforms. Though careful not to sensationalize, the coverage painted a clear picture of how governance mechanisms can be manipulated when transparency disappears. The former president's name surfaced publicly as well. Though formal criminal charges were still pending review, the referral itself altered his professional reputation significantly. Development partnerships quietly distanced themselves. Business affiliations re-evaluated involvement. Influence eroded rapidly once scrutiny replaced assumption. The development advisory firm that had explored acquisition strategies for corner lots withdrew its proposal from Maple Grove entirely. The expansion project dissolved before it could advance. Without cooperative leadership inside the HOA, leverage no longer existed. The strategy had depended on quiet compliance. Exposure dismantled it. Within the community, a special election was held to restructure the board. Homeowners who had never previously attended meetings now showed up in record numbers. Questions were asked openly. Policies were debated transparently. Oversight became an expectation rather than an afterthought. Elena did not run for a board position. She had no desire to control governance. Her goal had never been power. It had been protection. Instead, she chose something quieter. She attended meetings occasionally, not as a challenger, but as a reminder. Her presence alone carried weight. It symbolized accountability. It represented what documentation and persistence could accomplish when intimidation fails. Months later, the county prosecutor's office concluded its investigation into the falsified lien affidavit. While the outcome did not involve a high-profile courtroom trial, a formal finding of misconduct was entered into record. Civil penalties were imposed. Professional licensing consequences followed. The message was clear. Sworn documents cannot be manipulated without consequence. For Maple Grove Estates, the chapter closed slowly but decisively. The HOA revised its bylaws to include homeowner oversight committees. Digital transparency portals were created so residents could review enforcement logs in real time. Financial statements were published quarterly without redaction. What had once operated through selective control now functioned under collective visibility. Trust, however, rebuilt gradually. Some neighbors moved away, uncomfortable with the scrutiny that had followed. Others remained and adapted, recognizing that reform had strengthened the community rather than weakened it. And at the corner lot, with grey siding and white shutters, life returned to something resembling peace. Elena continued her work in accounting. Her son prepared for college. The house stood exactly where it had always stood, solid, steady, earned. But it now represented more than stability. It represented resistance. On a warm evening nearly a year after the first violation notice arrived, Elena sat on her porch watching the sun settle across the cul-de-sac. Children rode bikes down the sidewalk. Lawn sprinklers clicked rhythmically. The neighborhood once again appeared calm. Yet she understood something few others did. The greatest threat to a home is not always fire or storm. Sometimes it is paperwork. Sometimes it is authority disguised as procedure. And sometimes it is the assumption that no one will fight back. The HOA had plotted to take her home through pressure, documentation manipulation, and strategic intimidation. They believed the process itself would overpower her. They believed silence would protect them. But the shocking truth, that inspections were fabricated, that liens were altered, that enforcement was selectively weaponized, destroyed their plan completely. Not because of anger, not because of noise, but because of evidence. The house remained hers. The corner lot remained hers, and the system that tried to quietly remove her from it now operated under safeguards designed to prevent it from ever happening again. In Maple Grove Estates, the lawns were still trimmed, the sidewalks were still clean, but the balance of power had shifted permanently. Because one homeowner refused to surrender her home to intimidation, and in doing so, exposed a truth that changed everything. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so they can learn something from it too.